What I'd like to talk about this evening is how stories, the stories that we are told and the stories we tell ourselves affect how we see the world. And the purpose of this is to really kind of question the, like become conscious of, first of all, just becoming conscious of the stories. And then the question whether they actually align with reality. Emperor Wu, we learned in the second case of the Shoyo Roku, told himself a story that made him think he understood Buddhism until he met with Bodhidharma. And this meeting turned his understanding of Buddhism on its head. So Emperor Wu had some misunderstandings about Buddhism, even though he felt like he knew it. And this is a theme that Zen comes back to again and again and again. We think we understand something, we think we know something, but do we really? And so the heart, I think, of Zen practice is to continually question whether we're seeing reality or not. So what I'd like us to think about are, what are the stories we tell ourselves about who we are, both individually, personally, what are the stories we tell about who we are individually, and what are the stories that our country tells to us collectively as to who we are as a country. Keeping in mind that every culture has its mythology. And mythology, in the most positive sense, has to do with orienting ourselves to who we are, where we come from, and what we're about. And we may have some of these stories coming from various religious traditions, say, for example, Christianity. And there's also the story of how our country itself came to be. So the story, our country itself has a story, right? The United States began with Columbus's quote unquote discovery of America and continued with pilgrims, won its independence from Britain, survived Civil War, gradually expanded westward until it became the enormous rich country we see today. That is one of the predominant stories that we hear, that we're educated in, that we grow up listening to. Right? Just like the Emperor Wu's naivety about his understanding of Buddhism, Emperor Wu thought he was doing some good for Buddhism. And in a similar way, the story about the formation of America has us think America has been basically a benevolent country, and that America serves the world and maybe even saves the world through its many charities. And it's not that America hasn't done great things or some good for the world as a nation. It's not that, but we need to have a more realistic view of how America has behaved on the world stage, especially when it comes to its formation and history. So what I'm about to share is, for me, I don't stop getting shocked by this news. And for many people, it might be shocking, although it's not new. Even if you've heard it before and it's not news to you, you also may find it kind of shocking. Let's bring this back for a moment to Buddhism. The function of a koan, right? The function of a koan, this kind of introspection that one can do, is to undo our ideas about ourselves and undo our ideas about what reality is. And so the study of race in America is a koan that kind of serves a similar function. When we study race in America, I really think the study of race in America is our modern day koan, because it has us call into question who we think we are, both personally and as a country. I can't think of a better koan to really put our nose to the grindstone on that. It's what Dogen called the Genjo koan. There's all these koans, right? There's all these stories in the Shoyo Roku and other koan books. But Dogen said the main koan that we study is called the Genjo koan. The Genjo koan means, who am I and what should I do now in the present moment? And this is not just a koan for us personally, but also socially, collectively. What should we do? There's, as I mentioned earlier, there's two kinds of stories that we tell. There's the national stories that come from us through history, the stories around history, around religion, around culture. And then there's the stories we tell ourselves. So we're going to kind of focus on this first kind of story today, on the national level. What are the stories that we tell? And, as little kids, just absorbing information. And Zen has us question these stories. So we learn some things as little kids. As we grow up and we learn more information, receive more information, we may begin to question what are those stories that we're told. And the point of Zen really is to have us deal with the Four Noble Truths. The first one being is that there is suffering. So let me tell this just a little story here. All right. Sorry, I guess lost my place here. So this, I'll say a couple of things here. One is that when we are not in touch with suffering, not just personally, but socially, we're not in touch with reality. And the story that actually I just told about how, what America is a common story that we may have heard as little children, right? We heard about the Pilgrims, we heard about the first Thanksgiving, we heard about the great expansion of the United States across to the Pacific Ocean. And this gives us this may give you a feeling, or us a feeling of pride in being American. Like, wow, we did all this great stuff, man. And, but it doesn't necessarily connect us with not just the suffering that has taken place over the past 400-500 years, but with reality. Right? So we're coming back to this question of what is reality? So there's three things omitted from the national story, this particular story. One is that the United States was created from conquest in several stages. Right? The United States was not just acquired and peacefully found. The first stage was the European seizure of land occupied by the indigenous people that were here before us. Before European conquest, there was 9 to 18 million indigenous people. After, some 250,000 indigenous people. So huge loss of numbers. And that was due in part to warfare, also to disease and the lack of immunity from indigenous people. But needless to say, there was a forceful removal of indigenous people from the land. It was not like the image of the pilgrims, right? This image has us kind of, it tells a different story of the reality. You know, is this kind of image that we see here of pilgrims and native peoples, is that really real? Is this really what happened? Well, maybe there's some truth to it, the interaction between indigenous peoples and so-called pilgrims, maybe. But the reality of today tells us a different story, right? We see indigenous peoples on reservations, and for example, the rate of alcoholism is higher in indigenous peoples than any other cultures in this particular country. So that's an indicator. It's a symptom of a larger issue. It's a symptom of a larger problem. We know also that every treaty that was ever made between indigenous peoples and the United States in this country has been broken by the United States. We know that there was the massacre at Wounded Knee, where American military massacred men, women, and children. And so these stories don't necessarily get told, but they also paint us maybe a clearer picture of reality, of us as Americans, who we are. The second omission is that the United States could not have developed economically without slave labor. There was a huge shortage of labor in agriculture and industry during the colonial period, and enslaved Africans provided the needed labor that made the US growth possible. So the US went from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy thanks to slavery. Right? So there are, in this soil, buried the blood and the hard work done for free by slaves, Africans, African Americans, buried in our soil. A third omission of our national narrative is that the US seized almost half of Mexico through war. Right? This enabled the United States, this war with Mexico enabled the United States to reach the Pacific Ocean. In 1845, Texas, right? We can see it on the map here. Here's Texas. This was all a part of Mexico originally. In 1845, just 150 years ago, it becomes a part of the United States. 1853, Arizona becomes a state. And a big chunk of Arizona was given to the United States by Mexico under threat of another war with Mexico. So this is the reality of the story of the United States, and it paints a different picture of who we think we are. So sometimes we think we have like two stories about Mexico. Either we're doing Mexicans a favor by letting them into our country. We're doing them a favor by letting them in. Or the other narrative, and these are two, like they're on the same spectrum here. The other narrative is that Mexicans are generally speaking bad people. They steal our jobs. They need to be kept out. And I just want to suggest to you that this particular narrative also is part of our way of thinking. And I don't think one is necessarily, it might seem on the surface to be kinder than number two here. But if we look at this through the lens of interbeing, neither one of these is really accurate. And it doesn't take into account the historical relationship between the United States and Mexico. So what I want us to think about now is about our individual stories, the individual stories that we tell ourselves, particularly in relationship to African Americans. So I think we would probably prefer not to think about our understandings of people of color or our interactions with people of color. But I would like for us to start to think about our personal, like on a personal level now, on an individual level. We have the national narrative that gives us certain information about how to think about who we are and what we're about. We're generally good people. We've done a lot of great things for the world. We're generous. That's the national narrative. It's missing some pieces there, though. How about on the local level? How about on the individual level? What has been our relationship with people of color in our own neighborhoods? Think about when you went to school, when you just maybe in interactions on the playground. So I'd like to just share briefly my own a short story here. When I was growing up, maybe 12 years old, 13, I was playing a pickup game of football with some friends, and there was one black kid that was playing with us. And this black kid, in my mind, he had a reputation for being mean, for getting into fights, and for getting kicked out of school. And I saw him as I felt like it was kind of dangerous to be with him, but all of my other friends were playing. So I played with them. Well, I don't remember very much about that pickup game of football, except the very end, where one of the white kids that was playing with us, who was also mean, got in trouble a lot and got kicked out of school sometimes, said something I'll never forget. He said to the one black kid, they were getting into some kind of argument, and he said to the black kid, "Who were the slaves?" And I thought there was going to be a huge rumble. I didn't know how this was going to go down. The young black kid kind of doubled over, and he yelled out. He kind of like yelled out in pain. And then he turned around and left, and we all kind of just quit. But I had no adults with which to process that with. I felt a little bit of embarrassment, but I didn't know what to do with that. And I saw myself basically as a good person. And I had no idea how to respond in that situation. I wasn't taught. I wasn't told by any of, not by my family members, not by my school, not by my teachers. It's only years later that I've kind of remembering that event that I'm able to now continue to process that. So what I'd like us to do now is to do something similar, to think about, for you, what were your earliest encounters with people of color like? Maybe like sharing your stories about what went down when you were a kid. What do you remember? What do you remember, for example, about when you first learned about there being slaves or slavery? So this is an exercise in thinking about our own stories, our personal stories. Like, how have we been affected by the national narrative? How has that played out for us on our personal level? Okay.